Hi, I'm Rahul Chandwani, and let's get started with this chapter. Let's talk about Blender and some of the basics of the interface or UI, and just some basic information about shortcuts for those of you who are maybe a bit new to the software. So, for the past few years, my workflow has almost completely been in 3D and exclusively using Blender. Because Blender is such a versatile tool that allows you to do so much from modeling, texturing, rendering, all in one package. It's really become the one software where I spend almost all of my time in. And recently, as I've started to get used to my workflow and the tools, Blender has really started to feel almost like an extension of my mind. Kind of like when you're sketching or painting, you're so used to the organic process of using a pen or a brush that your ideas kind of just seem to flow into the canvas seamlessly. I think it's important to get to that point with 3D. And I think the first step is just personalizing your interface or UI to really just suit your needs and your personal work style, and kind of just minimize any hurdles or repetitive actions that usually break the flow of your workflow. Because creativity is such a delicate thing, and sometimes the smallest hurdle can completely break the flow of your work. So, in this video, let's just go through some basic things I like to set up before I start any project to kind of help kickstart my workflow. So, for those of you who have used Blender before, your startup file probably looks a bit different than mine, and that's because I've kind of edited my file to look slightly different just to have a few things that are ready for me to get started into a project. So for those of you who don't know, you can basically set up anything to be your startup file in Blender. So if you go down here in file defaults and save startup file, whatever you have in your scene right now will become the file Blender will show you every time you open up a new file or a new Blender file. So I just want to go through how I set up my startup file to just have a few things kind of ready to go before I start a project. So Blender, if you guys are aware, is like a super customizable software. You can have almost any of these windows be anything you want it to be. And if you go down here between any of these tabs, and if you go up here, you can kind of close or open up a new window if you want. And you can, if you go into the editor type here, you can have these windows be anything you want them to be. So I would recommend you guys also kind of familiarize yourself with these shortcuts, because I think it's annoying to go into this tab here and kind of find what I'm looking for, as I usually shift between a lot of these tabs quite often. It's just easy for me to kind of remember what each of them do. So for example, I know Shift F5 is my 3D viewport. I know Shift F10 is my UV editor, and Shift F3 is kind of my shader editor and kind of my compositor. So these are the few tabs that I use often. So I've memorized their shortcuts that, and I think it's small things like these that really help keep you in that creative flow state when you're working. So for my startup file, I like having the top part here as my 3D viewport, where I'll model, texture, render, light, everything. And on the bottom here, on the bottom left, I'll have this as my shader editor, and I'll switch this between the compositor and my shader editor as we start to get into the end parts of the project where I'm compositing my images as well. And on the right here, I have my UV editor, and that's pretty much how I like to set up my the tabs. Obviously up here we have all our object settings, render settings, and up here we have our outliner. I also like to have kind of like a human for scale in my startup file, as so that whenever I'm creating a new project, I know that everything is in reference to this human here. And this human is to scale, so this is 6 feet or 180 centimeters. So I know that what I'm creating is to scale to. I think that's also important, especially if you need to maybe in the future kind of port your scenes into Unreal, or especially if you're working in games where maybe you need to kind of keep in mind kind of this metric system. So it's important to always work to the right scale. I also want to talk about the outliner up here. So this is where you have all your objects and your collections. And for my startup file, I just have like having a few things organized, like my camera in my cameras collection, my lights in my lights, and kind of the human here and kind of like a people collection. And the reason I like to organize this is because as we start to build a scene and we have a lot of objects in our scene, It's important to kind of remember to categorize all your objects in their respective collections, because it really just becomes easy to manage your scenes when everything is well organized. So I think it's nice to have a start by just categorizing the basic things that I know that I'll need anyways, like my sun, my cameras. So this just means that no matter how many cameras I have in my scene, they're all going to be in this collection here, or no matter how many lights I have, they're all going to be in this collection here. So if you select an object and press M, you can put them into any collection you have already created, or you could also create a new collection and have it go there. So I'd advise you guys to kind of just go through or just kind of organize your initial startup file to have whatever you need and kind of have a very well organized outliner, because I think that will be important, especially as we start to create bigger scenes. Some more shortcuts that I keep in mind: your 3D cursor. So if you press shift right click, you can kind of take your 3D cursor to wherever you want it to be. And this is important because this basically determines where you will spawn objects. So if I have my 3D cursor here, I'll spawn objects there, and similarly here. And I also use my 3D cursor a lot to kind of snap objects in their own places. So if you press Shift S and press selection to cursor whenever you have an object selected, that object will snap to wherever your 3D cursor is. And on the other hand, if you select an object, press Shift S and cursor to selected, your cursor would snap to the center of whatever object you have selected. And that's important if you ever need to kind of align two objects together. Instead of eyeballing them, you can kind of just snap one object to the center of another without having to eyeball its location. So I'll do that a lot. I use this all the time. And I mean, I use it almost all the time when I'm working, because it's really useful to kind of be able to snap your objects from one place to another. Especially if I'm working from my camera viewport, it's just easy to be able to snap objects wherever I want them to be. The other one is your 3D overlay. So if you go here, you basically have this your overlay button, and what this is just all kind of it shows all the information about your scene. But sometimes I just want to switch this off, so the shortcut for that is Shift Alt Z. So if you're walking around and you just want to see what your scene looks like without all the overlays, you can just press Shift Alt Z and it kind of switches on and off these overlays. Another thing I keep in mind, just to kind of streamline your whole workflow, especially as you start to work, you'll realize that we'll be using a lot of tools that are hidden in all these complicated menus. So whenever you encounter anything in any of one of these menus, just know that you can add them to your quick favorites. So if you press Q, go down here, you'll have your quick favorites, and you can basically add anything you want. So for example, I want to add a cube, but I don't want to press Shift A and kind of go into adding a cube every time. I could just press right click and add to quick favorites. So now if I go into my quick favorites here, I have a cube here. So now, and you can pretty much do this for almost every action in Blender. So no matter what menu, you could go and add it into quick favorites. So that's just one thing to keep in mind, especially once we get into a bigger scene with more complicated things to do. It's just easier to have kind of the streamlined things that you are always coming back to into this handy section over here. So whenever you've added whatever you want into your scene, you could basically just go into File, Defaults, and Save Startup File. And now whenever you open up Blender, you will have kind of your startup file saved. And I think the most important part of this is the outliner, to kind of just have these collections here kind of just set up beforehand, so that you're making sure that you're always organized. And once we start getting into a bigger project, we'll be having a lot more collections. So it's nice to be able to just search them or have them organized here. Another thing I also want to talk about before we get into modeling is add-ons. If you guys ever want to install any add-ons, you could go into Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and Install from Disk. And one of the main add-ons that I use all the time is HardOps. And I'll just show you a few tricks that I use with HardOps that kind of streamlines a few things that are just, it streamlines a few things into kind of like a one action thing instead of having to do multiple things every time. So if you've installed HardOps and you press Q, you'll have this menu here for all the tools that HardOps gives you. And so for those of you who've used Blender before, you know that you have your modify section here, and you can basically add any kind of, you can add subdivisions, bevels, wireframes, etc. And HardOps kind of just streamlines a few of those actions. So for example, I use booleans a lot, and having to always go into my modifier to kind of set up my booleans can be annoying when I have to do them all the time. So with HardOps, it kind of just streamlines the process. So if you click the object you want to use as a boolean, and then use the object that you want to use the boolean for, and then press Q and press difference here. You also have your other boolean options down here, but if you press difference here, it kind of just creates this into a boolean object, and you can do this as many times as you want with one object. So this is just one kind of tool that I use HardOps for a lot. Also, another thing, arrays and radial arrays. So setting up a radial array through modifiers can be kind of complicated, and I use radial arrays a lot. So if you go down into mesh tools and your radial array, you've got it here. And so basically, if you play with your mouse and your cursor, you can basically add or remove as many of these arrays as you want. And you can also create a normal array down here. So you can see that I could just create how many other arrays I want. So HardOps kind of just streamlines some of those things. And I would advise you to just kind of go into this section here and kind of just look through some of the options here, like taper or even bevel. You can bevel your objects kind of easily instead of having to go into the modifier each time. Some other add-ons that I use are actually part of my asset browser. One of them is Desertscapes. So Desertscapes, if you go into a Blender Marketplace, is an add-on for foliage and trees, and they have like kind of this huge section of grasses, trees, bushes. So I use this all the time for any foliage that I need to add into my scene. And we'll talk about how I add foliage and how exactly I go about scattering foliage into my scenes later on. But this is just handy because you can add anything into your scene. You can add foliage directly into your scene. So I use desertscapes and junglescapes. They have a great section too. They're just different kind of themes, but they're all foliage. They're all trees, grasses, bushes, all that kind of stuff. So this is just a few of the add-ons that I have other add-ons that I use too, but we'll talk about them a bit later. But these are just a few of them that I thought are important if you want to choose to get them. You can do all of that without add-ons too, but I think it just having these few, especially HardOps installed, kind of just streamlines a lot of the process and saves a lot of time when you're working. So throughout this course, I would recommend you all to kind of just pay attention and observe how you work, your personal work style, what tabs are you always going back to, so that you can keep this in mind and kind of customize your own interface to be kind of personal to how you work. And over time, doing these simple things and keeping simple shortcuts in mind and simple windows in mind, simple setups in mind, can really be the difference between creating work and getting into the flow of work. Especially when you're starting out and it's always stressful to start a new project. So it's always nice to be able to have a file that's well set up and kind of personalized for your own workflow. So see you in the next video.